Cold river air carries the faint smell of wet stone, and somewhere below, the Lena moves past in a long, quiet sweep. Above the water, pale limestone rises in thousands of narrow walls and spires, softened by distance and early mist. At first, they seem almost too regular to belong here, standing over the dark belt of taiga in a silence that feels older than weather. From the river, the whole escarpment gathers into a single immense pattern. But as you drift closer, separate towers begin to emerge. They look less like something built than something slowly uncovered, as if time had been removing the softer parts for a very long while. This is the strange calm of the Lena Stone Forest, a landscape shaped not by a sudden event, but by patient layers of sea, uplift, frost, and river. What now appears remote and still began far from this cold interior, under shallow water filled with carbonate mud and quiet marine life. And the more closely you look at these pillars, the more they seem to hold two places at once, an ancient seabed and a Siberian cliff. So tonight, we can follow that long transformation slowly, from warm, vanished seas to this cold procession of stone above the river. From a distance, the wall seems almost continuous, like one pale margin laid against the forest. But the river keeps carrying you closer, and the first concrete difference appears. What looked like a smooth face begins to separate into ribs, then bastions, then narrow towers standing a little apart from one another. The eye adjusts slowly, and with that adjustment comes the first real question: why here? Why should this one reach of valley break into thousands of vertical forms while the neighboring slopes remain softer, wooded, and comparatively whole? The answer does not begin in the cliff alone. It begins in the way the Lena has cut its passage through a thick platform of old carbonate rock, exposing planes of weakness that had been waiting inside the stone for an immense length of time. That changes the view at once. These pillars are not objects placed on the landscape. They are the remaining parts of a much larger mass, left standing because fracture, frost, and runoff did not remove every section at the same speed. As the boat drifts along the bank, another detail emerges. Some towers are blunt and heavy, joined at the base like clustered trunks. Others, sharp and upward, thin and separate, with recesses between them where shadow lingers even in the morning light. Those differences matter, because they suggest that the stone itself is unevenly organized. Beds vary in hardness, cracks vary in spacing, water chooses some lines over others, and once that choice is made, the cliff begins to divide according to its hidden structure. The longer you look, the less accidental it seems. There is pattern here, but not the pattern of design. It is the pattern of repetition under patient conditions, where the same forces return year after year, season after season, and gradually make the wall legible. Below the pale escarpment, the dark taiga runs in a dense belt. Larch, pine, and spruce soften the foot of the slope, and from the river they make the stone seem even lighter. That contrast is part of the strangeness. A forest below, a forest of rock above, and between them, scree, ledges, and thin shelves where fragments from the cliff have gathered over time. The first escalation is simple, but it changes everything. The pillars are not standing on a flat plain. They rise above an active river valley, one of the great drainage corridors of northern Asia, where water, seasonal ice, thaw, and gravity continue to edit the slope beneath them. That means the Lena is not just scenery. It is one of the reasons the stone still appears so dramatically exposed. If soil had been allowed to build thickly at the base, if the slope had been smoothed and covered completely by vegetation, the vertical forms would read differently. They might still exist, but they would not announce themselves in this clear, processional way. The river keeps the edge open. It takes away what would otherwise blur the cliff into the hillside. That realization brings a quiet decision. Rather than stay with the broad view from midstream, we have to move closer to the base, because the large shape alone cannot explain the smaller separations. So the attention shifts from the skyline to the rock face itself, where the evidence becomes more intimate. Nearer now, the limestone loses some of its distant softness. Its pale surfaces show ledges, seams, cracks, and darker streaks where water has passed after rain or thaw. What looked from afar like smooth verticality is actually full of interruptions. Horizontal bedding lines move across the face like faint memory. Vertical joints cut through them, often straight enough to guide the eye upward in a single motion. That crossing of horizontal and vertical structures is one key to the entire landscape. The stone was laid down in layers, it was later divided by fractures. Then weather began to exploit both kinds of weakness at once. Beds determine where the cliff can step outward or recess inward. Joints determine where larger masses can separate into columns, fins, and isolated blocks. Once you see that geometry, the cliffs become less mysterious and more strange in a deeper way. They are understandable in method, yet still improbable in appearance. The Lena Pillars stretch for many kilometers along the river, and that scale adds another layer of calm. This is not a single outcrop or one exceptional tower. It is a prolonged edge in the landscape, a repeating architecture of erosion carried across a vast distance. The river helps reveal that length. As one group of spires recedes, another rises ahead through the mist, then another beyond it, so the escarpment feels less like a monument and more like an ongoing sentence written in stone. That repeated form leads to the next concrete development. If the pattern continues for so long, then the cause cannot be a local accident. It must belong to a broad body of rock, one that once extended farther back from the cliff edge than the present forms suggest. In other words, what now looks like a stone forest began as a limestone table or plateau, later opened, weakened, and pared back until only these projections remained. The implication is gentle, but it deepens the stakes. You are not looking at what was built. You are looking at what has not yet been removed. That is why the formations seem to hold absence inside them. Every narrow tower implies former continuity. Every slot between pillars marks a place where stone once connected. Every detached buttress is evidence that retreat is still underway, though too slowly for the eye to notice in a single visit. The river bends slightly, and with the change in angle, the wall changes character again. Some sections now resemble battlements, others resemble giant organ pipes. A few, seen in profile, look almost like standing figures in procession. Light does this, of course, but light can only reveal what structure allows. The geometry of the cliff is versatile because it has been produced by many repetitions of the same small events, not by one overwhelming one. Water seeps, water freezes, ice expands, fragments loosen, gravity takes them, runoff clears the loosened debris, the face retreats a little. Then the cycle begins again. Here, in this cold continental interior, those cycles have had extraordinary amounts of time. The setting itself sharpens that fact. Northeastern Siberia feels far inland, far from any living sea, yet the rock says otherwise. That contradiction is the next reveal, and perhaps the most beautiful one. This cliff, cold under mist and northern light, began as marine sediment. A place of winter river ice once lay beneath shallow water, where carbonate mud could settle, where shells, microbes, and mineral precipitation slowly built layer upon layer on an ancient seafloor. The imagination has to turn almost completely to accept it. The present landscape offers conifers, frost, permafrost, and long seasonal extremes. The original setting offered warm, sunlit shallows, suspended lime-rich particles, and quiet marine accumulation. Yet the cliff carries both worlds at once. Its present form belongs to cold air and river incision. Its substance belongs to vanished water. That gives the stone a double identity. It is a Siberian escarpment in one sense. In another, it is lifted seabed. And that dual nature explains why it can feel faintly unreal from the river. The mind keeps trying to choose a category, cliff or reef, fortress or sediment, mountain or marine remnant. The Lena Pillars sit between those categories and remain calm there. As the boat continues, you begin reading the rock differently. The pale faces are not merely surfaces now. They are pages of compacted chemistry and old life. Fine carbonate mud could settle in warm, shallow seas where little plastic sediment arrived from land. Tiny skeletal remains could accumulate. Microbial activity could influence precipitation. Over long spans, these materials would compact, cement, and alter into limestone and dolomite, preserving in mineral form a record of conditions far older than the valley itself. That shift from appearance to origin carries the story backward in time. The cliff no longer begins with frost, it begins with deposition. Before there were fractures to widen, there had to be beds to fracture. Before there were towers to isolate, there had to be a continuous mass. Before there was a river to expose the escarpment, there had to be rock elevated high enough for a river to cut into it. So the present scene, for all its stillness, already contains a sequence. Sea first, stone after, then uplift, then cold, then division. The order matters because if one stage changed, the visible result would change with it. If the sediments had been different, softer perhaps, the pillars might never have stood so long. If uplift had not raised them into exposure, the old seabed would have remained hidden. If the climate had not delivered repeated freezing and thawing, the fractures might have widened more slowly or differently. If the Lena had not carved its valley here, the edge would not be so boldly displayed. Each process depends on the one before it. That cause and effect is what turns the stone forest from a curiosity into a coherent landscape. Another development appears when you consider the broad geography. This is one of the most isolated continental interiors on Earth, a place associated with vast forests, long winters, and immense river systems. So the existence of a marine limestone escarpment here is not just geologically ordinary, it is emotionally disorienting in the gentlest possible way. The land feels firm and inland. The rock remembers open water. And because limestone forms so readily in shallow seas, the very material of the pillars becomes a clue to a world that no longer resembles the one around it. The river narrows against the cliff in places, and the pale stone rises more abruptly above the moving water. At these points, the relation between foundation and height becomes easier to feel. The Lena has cut down through resistant rock, and the exposed edge now stands as a steep front above the channel. That incision is not decorative. It is the condition that lets the pillars exist as visible forms. Without valley cutting, there is no dramatic face. Without a dramatic face, frost and runoff do not have the same opportunity to sculpt relief from the plateau edge. The river, then, is not merely passing the pillars. It has helped call them into view. Even the debris below the cliff tells part of the story. Broken fragments collect in fans and aprons. Some are pale and angular, newly fallen in geological terms. Others have weathered, split, or partly vanished into thinner soils where grasses and small shrubs can gain a hold. This is the consequence of continuous retreat. The wall does not fail all at once. It lets go piece by piece. And because the releases are distributed across such immense spans of time, the result looks less like collapse and more like filtration, as though weather has been sorting the rock, deciding what can remain vertical for a while longer. Soon, the direct observation from the river reaches a limit. You can see the cliff, its bedding, its joints, and the accumulating debris below. You can understand that the forms are erosional remnants rather than built towers. But to explain why the material is here at all, the mind has to leave the present bank and travel backward into an older environment. That is the next necessary step. The question is no longer only why these cliffs are divided. It is also why this valley contains thick carbonate rock in the first place. And once that question opens, the entire temperature of the story changes. The misty Siberian morning gives way, slowly and without rupture, to a much older world of shallow water spread over broad continental margins where layer after layer of lime-rich sediment settled in calm marine conditions. The transformation begins quietly. Imagine the same ground before forest, before frost, before river incision. Not a cliff, not even land in the familiar sense. A seabed under warm, relatively shallow water where sunlight still reaches down through the upper layer and suspended carbonate particles drift and settle with immense patience. In such settings, rock starts as softness, mud, fine sediment, tiny remains of marine organisms, chemical precipitates forming where seawater favors the growth of carbonate minerals. What is hard now began as something that could be stirred by a current. That contrast matters because it reminds you that geological solidity is often delayed. A landscape may look permanent in the present and still owe its existence to materials once loose, drifting, and almost weightless. Here, the evidence lies in the rock type itself. Limestone and dolomite are not arbitrary stones. They speak of deposition in seas, where calcium carbonate could accumulate over long periods, later altered by burial, pressure, circulating fluids, and time. So the next reveal is not a tower or a fracture. It is an environment. The Lena Stone Forest is strange because its pale walls belong to a world of shallow marine chemistry that seems wholly out of place beside a northern river and taiga slope. Once that is understood, the pillars begin to feel like exposed memory. The sea is gone, the sediments remain. And the quiet task now is to read how one became the other. If you could lower your hand into that vanished water, you would not touch a dramatic prehistoric world. You would touch something ordinary, almost plain, and that is part of the wonder. Shallow marine basins do not need spectacle to leave immense records. They need time, warmth, chemistry, and room for sediment to settle. Across long spans of the Paleozoic, broad epicontinental seas covered parts of what is now Siberia. They were not deep ocean trenches, they were inland seas and shallow shelves spread across low continental surfaces, where the water could be clear enough for carbonate material to accumulate. That single fact changes the pillars again. They are not made from some rare rock born in unusual violence. They are made from common marine ingredients, assembled patiently until common material became an uncommon landscape. In warm, shallow seas, calcium carbonate can gather in several quiet ways. It may come from the shells and skeletal parts of marine organisms. It may precipitate chemically from seawater under the right conditions. It may also be influenced by microbial communities living on or just beneath the sediment surface. None of this happens in a hurry. A little material settles, then more, then another layer, and another. Thin films become beds. Beds become stacks. Stacks become thick successions of carbonate mud and lime-rich sediment that harden only much later. So when you look at a Lena pillar in the present, pale and severe above the river, you are really looking at a sedimentary archive that began as accumulation so slow it would have been invisible within a single lifetime. That is the first important consequence of reading the rock as marine. The strange vertical forms owe their existence to a period when the landscape was horizontal. A sea floor is a level place by comparison. Its layers spread outward. Its differences are subtle. One bed may contain slightly more fossil fragments. Another may be finer, muddier, more evenly deposited. A later one may reflect a change in water circulation, salinity, or depth. Those small differences matter because they survive burial, and once they survive, they become future planes of weakness, resistance, or texture. So the towering cliffs of the Lena begin with flatness. That reversal is worth lingering over. What now feels like height began as depth beneath water. What now appears rigid began as loose sediment. And what now seems isolated began as a connected surface extending far beyond the edge we see today. The details preserved in carbonate rocks are often modest, but they are eloquent. Bedding planes record pauses, shifts, and repeated settling. Mineral textures can hint at changes after deposition, when fluids move through the buried sediments and altered parts of the rock. Sometimes fossil traces, fragments, or chemical signatures survive as reminders that these beds formed in living seas, not sterile water. Even where the cliffs do not present obvious fossil forms to the distant eye, the rock type itself remains testimony. Limestone is already a memory of marine conditions. Dolomite adds another layer of subtlety. Dolomitization, the process that alters limestone through magnesium-rich fluids, can change texture, hardness, and durability. That matters later because slight differences in resistance become visible once weather begins to work on the exposed cliff. The present architecture of towers may therefore depend, in part, on changes that happened long after deposition but long before erosion. A rock is never only one event, it is usually a chain. Sediment first, burial next, compaction after that, cementation, chemical alteration, then uplift, then exposure, then weathering, then collapse and retreat. By the time a single pillar stands over the Lena River, it has already passed through more environments than the eye can easily hold at once. Sea floor, buried strata, raised platform, frozen escarpment, and still the transitions between those states are usually gradual, not abrupt. Pressure from overlying sediment slowly squeezed water from the carbonate mud. Minerals precipitated in the pore spaces. Loose grains and fine lime-rich mud became stone. Later fluids moved through the rock, changing some layers more than others. That unevenness is important. A landscape like this does not need dramatic contrast in composition. It only needs enough variation that one bed resists weathering slightly better than the next. A little difference becomes a ledge, a little weakness becomes a recess, a line of joints becomes a future corridor for ice. The eventual cliff is already being prepared, while the rock still lies buried. There is another quiet strangeness here. The Lena Pillars look sculptural, but the material they are carved from is biochemical and sedimentary in origin. That means life, chemistry, and water did part of the earliest work long before cold air ever touched the stone. What feels severe was founded in softness. What feels barren was founded in environments shaped by marine organisms too small or too ordinary to seem monumental on their own. This is how deep time often works. It converts repetition into grandeur. Enough shell fragments, enough lime mud, enough patient burial, and eventually an escarpment rises over a northern river. The mind wants one dramatic answer to why the landscape is so strange, but the better answer keeps widening. It is strange because it joins incompatible images without conflict. Warm sea and Arctic interior, marine carbonate and boreal forest. Soft sediment and hard tower. No single stage cancels the others, they accumulate inside the scene. If you imagine the sea that once covered this region, the atmosphere changes. The cliffs, the taiga vanishes, the river valley vanishes too. In their place is a broad, shallow marine world, likely changing many times over millions of years, as shorelines advanced and withdrew, as sea level shifted, as local conditions altered the exact character of deposition. Not one unbroken scene then, but a long set of related conditions. At some times the water may have been clearer, favoring more direct carbonate production. At others, fine muds and chemical changes may have altered the developing layers. The result was not a single slab poured at once. It was a complex sedimentary sequence, built in intervals. That complexity helps explain why the present cliffs do not weather uniformly. Different beds respond differently when finally exposed. Some maintain steeper faces, some crumble more readily. Some form protective caps over weaker layers below. Some develop shelves where moisture lingers. These responses are late chapters in a story that began underwater. And because sedimentary rocks preserve original layering so faithfully, the old marine order still organizes the modern landform. Horizontal bedding remains visible across vertical stone. That visual contradiction is one of the most distinctive qualities of the Lena escarpment. Your eye climbs upward, but the rock remembers sideways accumulation. Seen from the river, faint bands and ledges crossing the pillars can feel almost architectural, yet they are not construction lines. They are depositional history left legible through erosion. This brings another consequence into view. The stone forest did not emerge from chaos. It emerged from a layered body of rock with internal rules. Those rules were written by ancient seas. Later processors could only edit what deposition had first arranged. Even frost, so powerful in its long repetition, must work with what the sedimentary structure allows. The old seabed remains the template. There is comfort in that continuity. However strange the pillars appear, they are not random. Their oddness has ancestry. Every recess, rib, and detached spur belongs to a sequence that reaches back through burial and uplift to marine sedimentation. To understand the cliffs fully, then, you have to picture not only the sea, but the rock deep underground after the sea was gone. For a long time, the sediments were hidden. More material lay above them. Pressure increased. Temperatures rose modestly with depth. Minerals recrystallized or cemented the sediment more firmly. What had once been soft marine deposits became competent bedrock. This buried phase is easy to overlook because nothing visible happens from the point of view of a human observer. Yet, it is crucial. Without lithification, there can be no pillars later. Sediment must first become something that can fracture. Compaction removes space. Cement binds grains and fine particles together. The result is a rock mass capable of standing in cliffs once exposed. And still, burial alone does not create a landscape. For that, the old marine layers had to return to light. That return is the next slow decision of the Earth. Tectonic forces do not need to hurl mountains upward in sudden gestures to matter. Broad regions can be lifted gently over immense spans. Basins can tilt, platforms can rise, former seafloors can become dry land, simply because the relationship between land level and sea level changes through time. In the case of the rocks that would become the Lena Pillars, uplift and long-term regional changes eventually brought the carbonate sequence high enough to enter a completely new world. Air replaced water. Rain and snow replaced marine suspension. Seasonal cold replaced shallow tropical or subtropical conditions. And once exposed, the rock entered the most transformative chapter of all. Still, before frost begins its work, there is a brief but important middle state to notice. Raised carbonate platforms are not instantly turned into stone forests. At first, they are simply bedrock landscapes, perhaps broad, perhaps subdued, perhaps weathered along joints and bedding surfaces, but not yet spectacularly carved. The future pillars require incision. A river must cut deep enough to create relief. Only then does the edge become vulnerable in the right way. Only then can a plateau margin become a cliff. This means the sea did not directly produce the towers. It produced the material. Burial strengthened it. Uplift exposed it. River incision presented it. Cold climate divided it. The order remains exact. Miss one stage, and the final scene changes. That sequence also answers part of the original question. Why did this one stretch of valley become so vertically carved, while surrounding land often remains more subdued? Because the Lena happened to intersect a thick, fractured, resistant carbonate body, and then maintained enough incision and slope renewal to keep its edge exposed. The pillars are therefore local in expression, but not accidental in cause. They arise where geology, structure, climate, and river history meet. The ancient sea supplied only the first condition, but without it nothing that follows would look the same. There is another layer of quiet evidence in the color and texture of the cliffs. Their pale tone reflects carbonate composition, and that brightness matters visually. Against dark conifer forest, limestone appears almost luminous in certain light. Mist gathers beneath it, low sun brushes ledges and projections. The forms look lighter than the world around them. This is not merely aesthetic. It reinforces the emotional separation between the pillars and the taiga below. A sandstone escarpment might read differently. A darker volcanic wall would belong to another story. But pale marine carbonate towering above boreal forest creates an immediate sense of displacement. The place feels inland and oceanic at once. Even the silence seems split between those identities. When ancient carbonate sediments are later exposed to meteoric water, meaning water from rain, snowmelt, and surface circulation, new processes begin to exploit the chemistry of the rock. Carbonate rocks can dissolve slowly in slightly acidic water. They can also fracture mechanically under cold conditions. In many karst landscapes, dissolution dominates and produces caves, sinkholes, and underground drainage. At the Lena, mechanical weathering tied to freezing, thawing, and structural weakness plays a major visible role in shaping the pillars. But the underlying solubility of carbonate rock still belongs to the story. It affects surfaces, enlarges pathways for water, and helps define how the rock responds through time. So even after the sea is gone, water remains central, first as depositional medium, later as groundwater and surface water, then as ice, then as the river itself. The same broad element persists while its form changes. The sea becomes rain, rain becomes seepage, seepage becomes ice, ice becomes fracture widening, runoff carries away debris, the river keeps the slope open. One watery history becomes another. That continuity gives the landscape a kind of coherence that is easy to miss if you focus only on the spectacular outlines of the towers. The Lena Pillars are not just stone. They are water made visible through delayed transformation. That idea may sound abstract, but the evidence is physical. Without marine water, no carbonate platform. Without circulating fluids during burial, no later mineral changes. Without precipitation on land, no infiltration along joints. Without seasonal freezing of that water, no frost wedging. Without a major river, no deeply exposed escarpment. Water is present in every chapter, though never in the same form twice. As the marine chapter recedes, another contrast grows clearer. The shallow sea that deposited these sediments was a world of accumulation. The exposed plateau became a world of subtraction. Deposition adds thickness, erosion removes it. The stone forest exists where those two tendencies meet across time. Layers had to be built before they could be carved. This gives the pillars a special kind of tension. They look additive, as if towers were erected upward, but they are subtractive forms. Space was taken away around them. The cliffs are records of loss arranged into beauty. That is why every gap between pillars feels meaningful. A gap is not emptiness, it is evidence of removal. And removal, in geological terms, can be just as creative as deposition. Sooner or later, once uplift had carried the old marine rocks into the realm of weather fractures, became decisive. Rock masses rarely exist without joints, bedding planes, faults, or subtle structural weaknesses. Some develop during burial and compaction. Some arise during tectonic stress. Some are inherited from several phases of deformation and release. Whatever their exact history here, the result is the same. The limestone and dolomite were not seamless. They contained planes and cracks ready to direct future breakdown. This is where the coming chapter on frost begins to gather itself. The sea made layers. Tectonics and long burial helped produce the structure. Now cold climate can use it. The pillars may look vertical and self-contained, but they were prepared from within. A narrow spire is often just a remnant isolated between widening fractures. A buttress remains because adjacent sections were more easily opened, loosened, and carried away. The geometry of the cliff is therefore not imposed from outside alone. Weather works from the outside in, yes, but guided by hidden architecture. That architecture is sedimentary first, structural second. Everything visible depends on both. It is useful to pause here and imagine a broad limestone table standing above a developing river valley. No towers yet, no deep slots, just an edge. Maybe irregular already, but still more continuous than what exists now. Water enters cracks. Snow accumulates. Thaw releases meltwater into joints. Then cold returns. When water freezes, it expands. That expansion can exert strong pressure on the surrounding rock, especially in confined spaces. Given enough cycles, small openings widen. Fragments loosen, blocks detach. The cliff begins to separate not everywhere at once, but along preferred lines. The process sounds simple, because it is simple. Its power comes from repetition, not drama. That is the essential character of the Lena landscape. No single event had to be extraordinary. Ordinary processes, sustained for immense durations, were enough. And because the climate of interior Siberia delivers severe seasonal contrasts, the cycle becomes especially effective. Long cold seasons preserve frozen conditions. Thawing periods introduce water. Repeated freezing and melting exploit every weakness available. The old marine platform, once passive beneath warm water, becomes active in a completely different sense. It begins to come apart. Yet even here, the result is not immediate ruin. Some masses remain attached for long intervals. Others detach and collapse into talus slopes below. Some layers weather into shelves that protect lower beds for a time. Some exposed faces smooth under one condition and shatter under another. The cliff edge does not retreat uniformly. It develops personality. Projections survive. Recesses deepen. Nearby towers that seem nearly identical from afar reveal different histories up close. One may be broader because its fractures are more widely spaced. Another may stand slimmer because two joints isolated it early. A third may have lost part of its crown where a weaker bed failed beneath a stronger cap. This variability is what lets the escarpment appear like a forest rather than a simple wall. The repeated verticality comes from common controlling factors. The individual differences come from local structure. As a result, the eye experiences both order and irregularity at once. That combination is a large part of the strangeness. A perfect wall would feel less alive. A chaotic slope would feel less legible. The Lena Pillars occupy the middle ground, where repetition and variation keep speaking to each other. This is also why distance changes everything. From far downriver, the formations blend into one luminous band. At middle distance, they separate into grouped towers and ribs. Up close, they dissolve again into bedding plains, fissures, blocks, and fresh breakage. The landscape shifts scale without ever becoming fully simple. Marine deposition explains the beds. Frost and erosion explain the divisions. The river explains the exposure. Only together do they account for the whole. The sea chapter, then, does not sit behind the present as a disconnected preface. It remains active as explanation. Without remembering the ancient shallow water, the cliff is only a scenic curiosity. With that older world restored, the entire escarpment becomes layered in time. Every pale face above the Lena is both a present landform and an exhumed marine surface transformed beyond recognition. And once the old sea floor is lifted into air, another kind of patience takes over. Cold begins to make decisions the sea never had to make. Water no longer settles softly across horizontal bottoms. Now it enters cracks. It lingers. It freezes. And the broad carbonate mass starts to divide along lines that have been waiting inside it for ages. That change can be pictured almost as a shift in rhythm. Marine deposition is spreading, blanketing, accumulating. Frost weathering is selecting, isolating, and retreating. One builds continuity, the other reveals discontinuity. Together they create the basic logic of the stone forest. The next evidence lies in the cliff face itself, where joints become visible as future separations and where the long work of freezing begins to pull the wall apart, a little more each year. At first, the rock might still seem secure. A plateau edge can remain broad and imposing even when it is already weakened internally. But cold landscapes often conceal their most important changes inside narrow openings. A crack a hand could barely enter may matter more than an entire sheer face. Once water repeatedly finds that crack, the future of the rock changes. This is the hidden beginning of the pillars. Not in the skyline, in the fracture. On the surface, the sequence is almost quiet enough to miss. Snow gathers over ledges and in shallow depressions. Spring thaw sends meltwater downward. Rain follows in milder periods. Moisture seeps along joints, bedding planes, and tiny imperfections. Then temperatures drop again. The water freezes. Its expansion presses outward on the rock walls. Perhaps almost nothing visible happens in one season, but not nothing. A grain loosens. A thin flake parts from the surface. A corner opens by the width of a fingernail. A small block settles under stress. The cliff records each change even when no one is there to witness it. What makes frost weathering so effective here is not merely the presence of cold, it is the alternation. Persistent deep freeze can hold a landscape still for long periods, but when temperatures move above and below freezing around exposed rock, water gains access and then turns to ice inside confined spaces. That cycle repeats. Interior Siberia is well suited to such long-term mechanical work. Seasonal contrast becomes a tool. Permafrost adds another layer. Ground that remains frozen at depth changes how water moves near the surface. It can keep moisture in the active layer, the upper zone that thaws seasonally, where seepage, saturation, and refreezing can all intensify weathering in the exposed escarpment. So the stone forest is not carved by cold in a vague sense. It is carved by a specific partnership between structure, moisture, and temperature change. The broad limestone mass already contained joints. Now freeze-thaw cycles enlarge them, and once joints widen enough, gravity enters the story more decisively. Detached fragments do not hover. They fall, slide, topple, or break loose onto the slope below. What remains attached begins to look more deliberate, even though the process is entirely patient and without intention. A narrow rib of limestone can stand simply because the fractures on either side opened first. A broader buttress can survive because its internal joints are farther apart, or because one bed near its crest resists breakage a little longer. This is the second important reveal of the frost chapter. The pillars were not raised as separate towers, they were selected out of a larger wall by repeated removal. Once that idea settles in, the whole escarpment changes character. It is no longer a cliff decorated with pinnacles, it is a retreating front, leaving behind temporary survivors. You can trace that retreat in the debris fields below. Fresh fragments lie angular and pale, still close in color to the exposed face above. Farther downslope, older blocks have split again, softened by lichens, dusted by needles, partly taken into the thin developing soil. Time works in layers here too. First fracture, then detachment, then fall, then smaller weathering, then slow incorporation into the slope beneath the living forest. The stone forest feeds the ordinary ground below it. That consequence keeps the landscape from becoming static. Even in apparent stillness, material is moving from wall to talus, from talus to soil, from soil to roots and runoff. The change is too slow to feel dramatic from one season to the next, but across long spans it is enough to redraw the entire valley edge. This is where the role of bedding becomes especially visible. Some layers hold a clean vertical face, others break into steps. A more resistant band may protect softer material beneath it for a while, creating ledges or shallow overhangs. Once that support is lost, the shape above changes as well, so the cliff does not retreat like a sheet being peeled back evenly. It retreats unevenly, according to tiny differences inherited from deposition and later altered by burial. The result is a wall that seems almost architectural from the river, even though its logic is geological through and through. In cold weathering environments, corners and projections often suffer first. They expose more surface area to air, to moisture, to temperature swings. A broad, continuous face may remain comparatively stable, while an already isolated spur is worked on from several sides. That means the very forms created by earlier erosion become more vulnerable once they stand out. Isolation is both the reason a pillar appears and the beginning of its eventual loss. That gives the Lena formations a quiet kind of impermanence. They look monumental. They are not permanent. Every tower has a future in which it will narrow, split, lower, and finally disappear into the slope below. But this does not make the scene feel fragile. It makes it feel measured. Geological impermanence is so slow that a human observer receives it as calm. The pillars stand long enough to seem fixed, yet not so absolutely that the landscape loses its sense of process. The annual rhythm helps explain this balance. During the colder months, water stored in cracks remains frozen for long stretches. Snow can gather in recesses and at the top of ledges, insulating some surfaces while loading others with seasonal moisture. When warmer periods arrive, even briefly, meltwater begins moving again. It enters openings already enlarged by previous years. It reaches slightly deeper, then the cold returns, and the widening continues. No single winter makes the pillars, no single thaw unmakes them. The power lies in accumulation of effect. In this way, frost weathering resembles the ancient sea that laid down the stone. Both work through repetition. Both depend on ordinary conditions returning again and again. One accumulates layers, the other opens them. There is also a subtle effect from aspect and exposure. A face turned slightly differently towards sun, wind, or prevailing moisture will not weather in exactly the same way as its neighbor. One side may dry faster. Another may hold snow longer. A narrow slot between towers can trap cold and shade. A projecting shoulder may shed water more quickly. Small climatic differences at the scale of meters become visible over immense time. That is why nearby formations can belong to the same cliff line and still appear unlike one another. The landscape is full of local decisions made by water and temperature. Permafrost adds still more complexity. In regions where the ground remains frozen below a seasonally thawed upper layer, drainage is often constrained. Water cannot simply sink as deeply as it might in warmer terrains. Instead, it may move laterally along thawed zones, collect above frozen ground, or linger in shallow fractures near the surface. This concentrates the action where the cliff is already exposed. It also means that the seasonal active layer, though thin compared with the whole bedrock mass, becomes disproportionately important. That upper zone is where weathering, seepage, root action, and repeated freezing can all interact. The frozen ground beneath acts almost like a hidden boundary, shaping how moisture is stored and released. So even in a place that feels dry and severe from a distance, the mechanics of water remain intimate and precise. The consequence is not merely breakage, it is patterned breakage. Joints become gullies. Gullies become separations. Separations become detached forms. Where fractures are closely spaced, the rock may break down into narrower fins or clustered ribs. Where spacing is broader, large bastions survive. Where horizontal weaknesses coincide with vertical joints, entire blocks can detach in recognizable sections. And where some layers are slightly stronger, the remaining forms seem to taper or crown themselves as weaker zones below are removed first. These are not random silhouettes. They are the visible edge of internal structure meeting climate. Seen in low light, the escarpment can resemble ruins. Seen from another angle, it resembles organ pipes. Seen from close below, it becomes simply fractured carbonate retreating under cold weather exposure. All three views are true at once. As the cliff face continues to open, runoff becomes more effective too. Loose fragments left on ledges or small shelves are vulnerable to meltwater and rain. Fine debris can be washed downward, so can small stones and weathered particles. This clearing matters because it prevents too much protective cover from accumulating on parts of the face. If every loosened fragment stayed in place, some surfaces would become insulated against further weathering. But where water strips away finer material, the rock remains exposed to the next cycle. In this way, runoff does not carve the pillars alone. It maintains the conditions that let frost keep working. This is one of the quiet partnerships that defines the Lena escarpment. Freezing opens, gravity releases, runoff clears, then freezing returns. You can see the outcome in the stepped slopes beneath the highest walls. Some sections are cluttered with blocks, evidence of recent or relatively recent attachment in geological terms. Other sections are cleaner, where smaller material has already been redistributed downslope. Vegetation enters here carefully. Lichens reach the more stable surfaces first. Grasses and herbs can take hold in pockets where fines gather. Small shrubs occupy protected niches. Over still longer spans, parts of the debris apron begin to look less like collapse and more like ordinary ground. Yet the source cliff remains above, continuing its quiet supply. That means the border between stone monument and living slope is always shifting. The stone forest is not separate from the ecosystem below. It is feeding it, physically and chemically, one fragment at a time. There is another reason the pillars become so visually sharp here. Once the Lena River cut deeply enough into the uplifted carbonate mass, the escarpment crossed a kind of threshold. Before deep incision, a broad limestone platform can weather without producing dramatic vertical relief. After incision, the exposed edge acquires enough height, steepness, and openness for differential retreat to become highly legible. At that point, continuity becomes difficult to maintain. The valley wall no longer behaves like a simple slope. It begins to partition into projections and recesses. That threshold is important because it explains why the stone forest feels inevitable once the valley reaches a certain depth. Not inevitable in exact shape, of course, but inevitable in principle. A jointed carbonate escarpment in this climate, opened by a major river valley, will not remain a smooth front forever. It will separate, it will retreat, and some remnants will stand longer than others. That is the irreversible midpoint of the story. After the valley opens sufficiently, the broad rock body cannot remain whole. The pillars are the consequence of that loss of wholeness. What you see from the river is the exposed edge of that transition, not fully wall, not yet slope. Once this becomes clear, even the strangest towers seem less like anomalies and more like stages. A detached pinnacle is a phase. A narrow fin is a phase. Each one belongs to a long sequence between intact plateau and redistributed sediment. The forms differ, but their direction is shared. They are all moving, however slowly, toward lower relief. The stone forest is therefore not an endpoint. It is a passage in the longer decay of an uplifted marine platform. And yet that does not lessen its beauty. If anything, it deepens it. Temporary forms in geology often feel the most expressive because they reveal process so clearly. A flat buried carbonate sequence conceals its future. A fully smoothed slope conceals much of its past, but a deeply dissected cliffline like this shows both. It still carries the bedding of the old sea and already displays the fracture patterns of retreat. It is readable in several timescales at once. The eye climbs one tower, notices a recessed joint beside it, follows a ledge across to another, then down to the talus below. That visual path is also a process path. Bed, fracture, isolation, fall. Redistribution. No single step is dramatic by itself. Together they create a landscape unlike almost anything around it. The surrounding plateaus and forested slopes help sharpen that contrast. Beyond the escarpment, much of the terrain remains more subdued, covered by taiga, softened by soil and vegetation. The cliffs stand out not only because they are tall, but because they are revealed. Their internal order has been brought to the surface. This is part of why the Lena Stone Forest can feel so improbable to first-time visitors. The neighboring land keeps the ordinary face of the region. The pillars show the hidden geology laid bare. The calmness of the place can make that revelation even stronger. There is no need for turbulence, no need for smoke, lava, or crashing surf. Quiet is enough. The cliffs are dramatic only because time has had so much room to work. At some points along the escarpment, sets of joints intersect in ways that produce more blocky forms. At others, one dominant direction creates long ribs and narrow vertical partitions. This structural control gives the wall its variety. It also explains why certain sections appear almost ruined, while others resemble clustered trunks or fluted columns. Different fracture patterns are translated by weather into different kinds of residue. The river traveler sees style. The geologist sees spacing and orientation. The truth is both intimate and broad. What appears as personality in the landscape is often geometry under erosion. Still, it would be too simple to reduce everything to cold mechanics. Light matters too. not as a cause of erosion, but as a cause of perception. Morning mist can obscure the bases of the towers, making them seem to rise directly from cloud. Low summer sun drags long shadows through every slot and recess, exaggerating separation. Under flat light, the wall may seem more continuous again, and the pillars retreat into a pale, unified front. The same stone can be read in several ways, because its relief hovers near the boundary between wall and multitude. That visual instability is part of the strangeness the title points toward. The formations are never just one thing. They are constant in process, changing in appearance. By now the roll of frost is clear enough to stand on its own. The old sea floor was raised into air. The river cut into it. Cold exploited the fractures. Gravity removed the loosened pieces. Runoff cleared what could be carried away. And over very long spans, separate forms emerged from a formerly continuous rock mass. But once the valley is opened and the stone divided, another partner becomes impossible to ignore. The Lena itself is not only the setting, it is a shaping force that keeps the whole arrangement visible. A river this large changes the meaning of every cliff above it. Its channel establishes the base level toward which erosion works. Its seasonal rhythms influence moisture, slope clearing, and local exposure. Its ice, floodwater, and sediment movement help maintain the sharpness of the valley margin. Without that continuing relationship, the pillars would still weather, but they might not stand in such a clean and dramatic procession beside open water. The first sign of this partnership is at the foot of the escarpment, where the slope meets the narrow river terrace or directly meets the channel in steeper sections. Material falling from above does not simply accumulate forever. Some remains and builds talus, some is reworked by runoff, some may be undercut or redistributed during periods of high water. This continual adjustment prevents the lower slope from stabilizing completely. As a result, the cliff can continue to read as cliff. The river keeps renewing the edge. During spring breakup, the Lena becomes a very different presence than in still summer weather. Ice that has held the river in place through winter begins to loosen. Water levels rise with thaw from the vast basin upstream. Debris shifts. Banks are wetted and reworked. No single spring flood needs to be catastrophic to matter. Its significance lies in repetition, just like frost. Each annual cycle helps move sediment, trim the river margin, and maintain the valley as an active corridor rather than a dormant trench. That, in turn, helps preserve the dramatic exposure of the pillars. A valley left entirely to soil accumulation and slope stabilization would slowly blur. The Lena resists that blurring. It keeps the lower boundary mobile. There is a paradox here that feels central to the whole landscape. The river erodes the escarpment by supporting slope retreat and clearing debris. Yet by doing so, it also preserves the visual power of the pillars. If the river did not remove material from the base system, the cliff line would become more buried. If the cliff line became more buried, the towers would lose some of their vertical force. So the Lena is both undoing and displaying the stone forest. This is a very old geological relationship. Many striking escarpments persist not because erosion is absent, but because erosion is organized. Material is taken away at a rate that keeps relief legible. The Lena provides that organization. It is patient, broad, and seasonally variable, but always directional. It gives the valley an open face. You can feel this most clearly from the water. From the river itself, the formations are not distant mountain shapes. They are immediate valley-side architecture. The channel runs parallel to the wall for long reaches, allowing the eye to follow one set of towers into the next. Mist rises from the water in cool hours. Low cloud can hold close to the pale stone. The surface of the Lena reflects fragments of the escarpment in broken patterns. This is not incidental beauty. It is evidence that water remains the frame through which the pillars are encountered. The river grants the correct distance. Too far, and the formations merge into abstraction. Too close on land, and the larger procession is harder to see. From the channel, the the scale becomes understandable. The annual ice cycle adds another layer of quiet force. River ice is not merely frozen surface water, it affects bank processes, moisture conditions, and the seasonal timing of change. As ice forms, thickens, and later breaks, it participates in the physical life of the valley edge. At breakup, ice and rising water can disturb accumulated material near the margins. In winter, frozen conditions influence how seepage and surface water are stored and later released. Again, nothing needs to happen all at once. The significance is cumulative. Seasonal ice links the river to the climate of the cliffs in a very direct way. Both are governed by freeze and thaw. Both become agents of renewal through repetition. Sediment transport matters too, even if the grandest towers make the finer material easy to overlook. The Lena drains an enormous basin. It carries silt, sand, organic matter, and dissolved minerals over great distances. Along the base of the escarpment, that moving load can affect terraces, bars, and small slope deposits. Sediment may bury some features temporarily and strip others back later. These modest shifts help determine where vegetation can establish, where runoff channels persist, and how sharply the cliff appears above the bank. A landscape can look timeless and still be constantly adjusted in small ways. That is exactly the case here. Where the escarpment bows inward slightly, moisture and debris may collect differently. Where the river presses closer, the base can remain cleaner and steeper. Where small side gullies descend from the uplands, they deliver additional water and sediment to the main valley edge. Each small tributary incision can widen a notch, separate a buttress, or create a local recess in the wall. The Lena is therefore not acting alone but as the main axis in a network of water movement. The large river establishes the open corridor. Smaller channels and surface flow refine the details. The result is a scalloped, varied line rather than a simple uniform cliff. Seen in changing weather, this partnership between river and stone can seem almost theatrical, though nothing is staged. Morning mist gathers in the lower reaches and makes the towers appear to float above the forest. After rain, darker streaks on the pale carbonate reveal active pathways of moisture down the face. Under dry, high summer light, the cliffs brighten and their ledges sharpen. In winter, snow fills some crevices and emphasizes others, turning the whole escarpment into a quieter geometry of white and pale grey. These atmospheric changes do not alter the geology in an instant, but they alter reability. They teach you to see that the wall is never just stone. It is stone in relation to air, water, season, and angle of light. That is why the pillars can seem to change identity from hour to hour. The rock remains. Perception moves across it. One stretch resembles a fortress in morning shadow. The same stretch becomes a line of tree trunks in evening haze. Another reads as a crowd of statues when the sun drops low enough to isolate one projection after another. These shifting impressions are not illusions in a trivial sense. They are clues to how finely articulated the cliff really is. A simpler wall could not support so many visual readings. The Lena River helps stage those readings by placing the observer at a moving lateral viewpoint. As the boat or the imagined drift proceeds, the angle changes continuously. Profiles sharpen, then flatten. Hidden alcoves appear and vanish. Detached towers merge back into the main face depending on where you are. This movement along the river is crucial to understanding the stone forest. The formations are not best understood from one fixed point. They unfold sequentially. The wall is a procession. Every bend reveals another arrangement of persistence and loss. Along the lower slopes, life settles into the spaces this geology creates. The cliff is not bare from top to bottom. Ledges hold thin soil. Shaded cracks preserve moisture. Scree aprons collect seeds, needles, and wind-blown dust. Trees below soften the base. In places, sparse grasses and small shrubs take root where the debris has rested long enough. This living margin matters because it keeps the stone from seeming purely mineral. The Lena Valley is a meeting line between hard vertical rock and the gentler continuity of boreal forest. That contrast increases the monumentality of the pillars, but it also humanizes them. They do not stand in emptiness. They stand above a quiet ecosystem that accepts their debris, shades their feet, and fills their recesses with birdsong during the short season of warmth. Lichens are among the first visible colonizers on more stable rock surfaces. They do not need much soil. They ask only for time, light, and a foothold. On pale carbonate, their patches may appear muted, grey-greenish, sometimes darker after moisture. They etch the cliff with a living patience that mirrors the stone's own. Where moisture persists a little longer, mosses may gather in small seams. In thinner pockets of sediment, tiny flowering plants can appear during the brief warm season, using a very short window of light and thaw. Their roots do not go deep. They go where they can, into grit caught on ledges, into narrow shelves, into old fragments of limestone that have already started becoming soil. That detail matters because it changes the cliffs from scenery into habitat. The walls are severe from a distance, yet up close they are full of small permissions. A crack can hold moisture, a shelf can hold dust, dust can hold a seed. And once one living thing gains a hold, others often follow. This is how the escarpment becomes ecologically varied without ever losing its austere character. The Lena Pillars rise directly above Tiger, but they do not behave exactly like the forested slopes beyond them. Their pale carbonate faces reflect light. Their ledges warm and cool differently. Some sections dry quickly under sun and wind. Others remain shaded and damp for much longer. That means conditions can shift sharply over only a few meters. One recess may be cool and moist, another just beside it dry and exposed. A narrow seam with seepage can support moss and lichen, while an adjacent sunlit rib carries almost nothing at all beyond a thin dusting of life. This is the ecological anomaly hidden inside the geology. The pillars create microhabitats, not broad ecosystems in themselves, but little climates held inside stone. Below them, the taiga has its own steadier logic. Larch and pine dominate where soil is deeper. Spruce can gather in cooler, moister pockets. Understory plants follow the rhythm of the boreal forest, adapted to long winters, short summers, and often thin, cold ground. But the cliff interrupts that continuity. It inserts bare mineral surfaces, broken slopes, and sheltered alcoves into the forest edge. That interruption makes space for species that would not be as common on a simple wooded incline. The result is not abundance in the tropical sense. It is contrast, quiet contrast. Plants of dry, exposed surfaces can occur not far from species that prefer seepage and shade. Insects move between them. Birds use the difference. Even the thin soils on the debris fans below the cliffs tell a different story from the soils farther back in the forest. They are younger, less settled, more directly connected to fresh rockfall. That gives them a transient quality. A patch of vegetation may establish for a while, then be disturbed again by new material from above, or by changing drainage after snowmelt. So the ecosystem at the foot of the pillars is not static. It is being edited by geology in slow motion. This is one of the gentlest but most important consequences of the stone forest. It is not simply standing over life, it is helping arrange life. The plants and animals here respond to fracture patterns, light angles, debris movement, and the chemistry of carbonate rock. What appears monumental at a distance becomes intimate when you notice how many small organisms are living in the consequences of erosion. Birds are part of that intimacy too. Cliff ledges offer shelter and vantage. Crevices can become nesting sites. Open air above the river gives space for movement, while nearby forest provides cover and feeding grounds. Some species may use the wall only seasonally. Others rely on the mosaic of river, slope, and cliff more regularly. Their presence softens the architecture of the escarpment. A tower that seems like pure stone from far away may hold a nest, a perch, a brief flutter of wings, disappearing into shadow. That slight motion gives scale to everything else. It also reveals that the pillars are not empty relics. They are active margins in the living valley. Insects too participate in this small economy of niches. Sun-warmed rock can attract them. Short-lived blooms on ledges can feed them. Moist seams and mossy patches create tiny zones of shelter. Then birds follow those insects, and seeds follow the birds, and the biological pattern becomes just a little more intricate. None of this overwhelms the stillness of the place. It fits inside it. The Lena Pillars do not host lush abundance. They host persistence, things that can tolerate thin soil, exposed weather, brief growing seasons, and the constant possibility that the ground beneath them is only temporarily stable. That same condition shapes the debris slopes beneath the cliffs. Talus is often thought of as barren, but even fresh stone begins entering ecological time as soon as it comes to rest. Temperature shifts crack it further. Dust accumulates in the spaces between blocks. Organic matter catches there. Needles, leaves, bits of bark, the remains of insects. Moisture lingers in small voids. Lichens arrive. Then, slowly, other organisms can use what they make possible. This means the cliff is continually producing not just rubble, but future habitat. One fallen block is a fragment of old seabed becoming new ground. In places where carbonate fragments weather into fine material, soil chemistry can differ from that of surrounding areas. That can influence which plants gain a foothold. A limestone-derived substrate does not behave exactly like all the other materials in the broader taiga landscape. So the stone forest does not simply add vertical relief to the river valley, it also adds ecological diversity through its material. The rock changes the soil changes the plants. The plants change the small lives that gather around them. This is what makes the Lena Pillars feel inhabited without ever feeling busy. Life here is distributed in quiet increments. A few stems on a ledge, a patch of lichen on a sunlit face, a bird circling near a buttress, a thread of moss where seepage darkens the stone. Everything remains sparse, but sparsity can be very expressive. In a lush place, life can hide form. Here, life reveals it. Because growth is limited, every plant seems to underline the shape of the rock it occupies. A shrub marks a shelf, a moss patch marks a water path, a line of stunted trees marks the lower edge of fallen debris that has rested long enough to settle. The stone writes the map first. Living things read it afterward. There are also seasonal pulses that briefly soften the whole scene. During the short northern summer, some slope patches can green quickly. Flowers may open in thin soil where warmth, drainage, and light briefly agree. Insects become more active. Birdsong appears in places that would feel almost silent in colder months. Then the season turns again. Growth slows. Leaves fade. Snow returns. The cliff regains its sterner outline. But even then, the ecosystem does not disappear. It simply quiets. Needles remain on conifers below. Lichens continue their patient work. Seeds wait. Roots hold where they can. The landscape keeps its living edge even under long cold. That continuity between seasons matters because it prevents the Lena Pillars from seeming like a dead remnant of geology alone. They are old, yes. They are mineral and severe. But they are also woven into annual cycles of thaw, bloom, nesting, dormancy, and snow. The stone forest belongs to deep time and seasonal time at once. And this overlap becomes even more interesting when the wider Lena Basin is considered. The river valley and its surrounding regions carry traces of much older life as well. Fossils, ancient sediments, and the broader geological record of Siberia all remind you that the present ecosystem is only the latest layer. The rocks here do not merely support living communities. They preserve evidence that very different communities existed long before the taiga. Marine life left the carbonate foundation. Later climates left other marks. The place is ecologically quiet in the present, but historically crowded with vanished environments. That wider perspective deepens the strange feeling of the pillars. You stand among larch and limestone, Yet beneath your attention lies a sequence of extinct seas, altered climates, shifting river systems, and repeated ecological replacements. Nothing about the present scene announces that loudly. It is the kind of truth the landscape keeps calmly to itself. And that may be one reason the Lena Stone Forest feels so difficult to place emotionally. It is not only that the forms resemble ruins or towers, it is that the place contains more history than the eye can easily hold. The living softness around the cliffs helps with that. Trees gather at the base, shrubs move into debris fans, birds cross the face, lichens soften the edges. These things keep the escarpment from becoming abstract. They return it to scale. A single towering rib of limestone may represent an immense geological sequence, but a small pine rooted beside fallen fragments reminds you that time also moves in years, not just epochs. The landscape becomes readable through both. That balance is especially clear if you imagine moving slowly from the riverbank into the forest below the cliffs. At the water's edge, the river dominates. Its broad movement and reflective surface draw the eye laterally. Step inland a little, and the base of the escarpment rises through trunks and needles. The forest floor carries its own textures: moss, cones, fallen branches, sandy or stony patches depending on drainage and deposition. Then the slope steepens. Fragments of limestone become more common. Soil grows thinner. Vegetation becomes patchier. Eventually, the living continuity breaks into ledges, stone, and scattered rooted holdouts. This vertical transition from river to forest to cliff is one of the quietest marvels of the place. It compresses several worlds into a narrow band. The same compression occurs in climate. Near the river, moisture and mist may linger. On the exposed stone above, sun and wind can make conditions harsher. In shaded crevices, cold can persist longer. A bird or insect moving only a short distance may cross several microclimates. This is why ecologists often find complexity in places that first look simple. A wall of stone is never just a wall if it changes light, runoff, and shelter. Here, the geology engineers variety. Even absence has ecological meaning. Where plants do not grow, bare stone absorbs and reflects heat differently. Where soil cannot persist, runoff is faster. Where ledges stay clear, birds may perch. Where no debris accumulates, roots cannot establish. A lack of growth is not emptiness. It is a condition shaping what happens nearby. The Lena Cliffs are full of these indirect effects. They channel water into one seam and deny it to another. They create shade with one projection and exposure with the next, and life organizes itself accordingly. The broader boreal landscape surrounding the pillars adds another layer of patience. Taiga ecosystems are not fast in the way lush, temperate, or tropical forests can be. They are often defined by slow growth, long winters, thin soils, and seasonal concentration of activity. That makes them especially well matched, in mood at least, to the stone forest above. Both rock and forest are economies of endurance. Neither wastes much. The trees are shaped by short summers and cold ground. The cliffs are shaped by fracture and frost. Put together, they create a landscape of restraint. Nothing rushes. Nothing overflows. Everything persists by fitting the conditions exactly. This quiet fit extends down to the river itself. Aquatic life in the Lena corridor, though less visible from the cliff base, is part of the same system. Water temperature, seasonal ice, sediment load, and channel shape all influence what can live there. Fish move through the river. Invertebrates occupy its shallows and margins. Organic material from forest and bank enters the current. The cliffs help shape that river edge by contributing sediment, directing runoff, and controlling slope form. So even below the surface, the stone forest is participating. Not symbolically. Its fragments, its drainage, its shadow, and its form all matter. The river corridor is therefore not just a line beside the pillars. It is an ecological connector. Forest, cliff, slope, and water all meet there. If you widen the frame further, The Lena Basin also carries paleontological significance that deepens the mood of ancientness without disrupting the present calm. Siberia is a region where traces of long-vanished animals and ecosystems have been preserved in sediments, permafrost, and exposed strata. The Lena corridor belongs to that broad world of preserved time. You do not need to leave the pillars entirely to feel this. The same cold that slows decay today has, in other contexts across the region, helped retain evidence of much older lives. The same basin history that shaped the river and its valleys also preserved records of changing climates and environments. This means the Lena Pillars sit inside a much larger archive. Not only a geological archive of marine carbonate and frost-sculpted escarpment, but a regional archive of life through time. That expanded context adds weight to the quiet. The place is not silent because nothing happened here. It is silent because almost everything happened too slowly or too long ago to make noise now. That is a different kind of drama. One without eventfulness. One based on accumulation and retention. Even archaeological traces in the wider basin, where ancient human presence and long patterns of movement have intersected with river corridors, contribute indirectly to this sense that the landscape has been legible for a very long time. But the cliffs remain the focus. They are the fixed margin around which all these ages seem to gather. Marine age, ice age, forest age, human noticing, all of them touch the same pale walls. Yet the walls themselves remain indifferent, still responding mainly to water, temperature, gravity, and time. That indifference is soothing rather than cold. The Lena Pillars do not need to perform their history. They simply hold it. And because they hold it so quietly, the living details around them become more precious. A line of larch at the base is no longer only vegetation. It is the latest softness, arranged around ancient hardness. A nest on a ledge is not only a small ecological fact. It is present life resting inside a landform built from vanished seas and long winters. The cliffs feel inhabited precisely because they are so much older than what inhabits them. This relationship between severe form and soft life may be the most inwardly affecting part of the whole landscape. If the Lena escarpment stood in a barren desert plain, it would tell another story. If it rose from dense, humid jungle, it would tell another. But above the Siberian taiga and the slow, broad river, it becomes something balanced. The stone is uncompromising, yet not lonely. The forest is gentle, yet not dominant. Each makes the other easier to understand. The mind can move between them. From the cliff, you learn duration. From the trees, you learn season. From the river, you learn continuity. And because all three are present together, the place resists simple classification. It is not just a geological wonder, not just a scenic river valley, not just a northern ecosystem. It is the overlap. That overlap is what gives the Lena Stone Forest its peculiar calm. It feels complete and incomplete at once. Complete because the forms are so fully themselves. Incomplete because they are still being shaped, still being colonized, still slowly changing. Even the highest pillars are not finished. They receive lichens. They lose fragments. They cast shadows that move with each hour and each season. In that sense, the cliffs are less like monuments and more like conditions. Long-lasting conditions, certainly, but active ones. And from this close attention to life along the stone, the next movement naturally rises upward. The lower ledges, debris fans, and forest margins have shown how the pillars participate in the living valley. Now the view begins to climb. Not away from those details, but above them. Because there is another reveal waiting higher on the ridge, one that can only be felt when the individual towers start to merge into a broader pattern again. From below, a single pillar can seem self-contained. From the water, a cluster becomes a procession. But from above, the whole stone forest begins to show what it really is. Not an isolated marvel, but the broken edge of a vast ancient table. The climb itself changes the scale of attention. At the base, your eye reads cracks and ledges. A little higher, it begins to read slopes and buttresses. Higher still, the river widens in view, and the line of the escarpment begins to extend beyond the reach of immediate detail. This shift matters because perspective has been part of the Lena's strangeness from the beginning. The place changes identity with distance. Nowhere is that more true than from the upper paths and lookout points. As you rise, the first thing that changes is the relationship between the pillars and the forest. From below, the taiga seems to gather at the stone's feet. From above, you see that the forest continues far inland, stretching beyond the cliff edge in a broad, dark continuity. The pillars are not separate mountains. They are the exposed front of a larger rock platform embedded in a much wider landscape. That realization is the next major evidence. The stone forest is an edge phenomenon. It is not a random concentration of towers standing alone on a plain. It is the dissected margin of a plateau-like body of limestone and dolomite that once extended more continuously behind the present face. This is easier to understand from the ridge because the top surface, though not perfectly flat in any simplistic sense, carries the memory of broad structural continuity. The cliffs below are dramatic because they are the broken front. The land behind them is quieter because much of that rock remains less dramatically exposed. Seen from above, recesses and projections that felt monumental from the river begin to line up into a more intelligible pattern. Coves, detached towers, ribbed sections, and narrow vertical separations all reveal themselves as variations along the same retreating escarpment. The forest of stone becomes, in a sense, less mysterious and more profound. Its oddness is no longer just resemblance to ruins. Its oddness lies in how consistently geological process has translated hidden structure into visible repetition. One detached tower is interesting. A long sequence of them, all related to the same plateau edge, is something deeper. It tells you that the landscape is not making isolated gestures. It is following a rule. The ridge paths also reveal how asymmetrical weathering can be. A projection that seems sharply defined from one angle may taper into the plateau more gradually than expected. A recess may open into a side drainage rather than simply ending in shadow. This matters because it shows that the pillars are not only vertical forms, they are parts of a three-dimensional retreating front, shaped by drainage direction, fractured geometry, slope exposure, and the varying persistence of individual rock masses. From the river, the wall can seem like a facade. From above, it becomes a process field. You can trace how small gullies incise the top and direct water toward the cliff edge. You can see where blocks have detached and where wider masses remain. You can imagine the line of future retreat, not precisely, but in principle. The edge is still moving. Very slowly, yes. Too slowly for the eye in one visit, but not too slowly for the landscape. This broader view answers the title question in a more complete way. Why is the Lena Stone Forest so strange? Because it sits between categories at every scale. From far away, it resembles architecture. Up close, it becomes fractured sedimentary rock. In deep time, it is marine deposit. In present form, it is cold weather escarpment. Ecologically, it is both austere and inhabited. Topographically, it is both plateau edge and towered wall. The strangeness comes from all these identities coexisting without cancelling one another. The high viewpoints make that coexistence visible. They also reveal the extraordinary length of the procession along the Lena River. The formations continue beside one of the world's great river systems, not as a single iconic cluster, but as a sustained encounter between water and carbonate escarpment. That length is easy to underestimate from the ground. From above, the rivers sweep, and the wall's continuity become legible together. The scale expands. The pillars are not local ornaments. They are part of a regional landform relationship. The Lena gives them exposure. The plateau gives them substance. The climate gives them shape. And the ridge lets you see all three at once. Light becomes even more important up here. From the ridge, shadows do not simply darken the stone, they explain it. A shallow recess that seemed decorative from below becomes evidence of a weaker bed or a more open set of joints. A projecting bastion catches the low sun and shows how much rock around it has already been taken away. The whole escarpment starts to read like a long edge under revision. That is one reason the place changes so much with season. In high summer, when the northern light lingers and evening arrives slowly, the pillars can appear almost weightless. Their pale faces hold brightness late into the day. The forest below grows darker first, and the river becomes a long band of muted silver, so the stone seems suspended between land and sky. This is not a trick of beauty alone. It changes the way structure is perceived. Long slanting light reaches into cracks and grooves that a flatter midday sun would ignore. A narrow slot between towers deepens into a band of blue-gray shade. Small ledges declare themselves. Detached blocks stand out from the main face. What was pattern becomes anatomy. In autumn, the effect shifts again. Haze can soften the far distance, and the taiga may warm into rusts, golds, and dim yellow before the long cold returns. Against that muted color, the limestone becomes more severe. Its pale surfaces look cooler. Its verticality feels more exact. The formations may no longer resemble a forest quite so strongly. They may read more like a procession of standing fragments, each with a little more separation, a little more silence around it. Winter is another identity altogether. Snow gathers in shelves, joints, and on the upper surfaces of fallen blocks. It rounds some edges and sharpens others. A ledge that vanished in summer may become visible because snow catches there and nowhere else. A recess may darken by contrast, appearing deeper than it is. The entire escarpment becomes quieter, not because erosion has stopped, but because the visual noise of vegetation and shadow has been reduced. Pattern takes over. Bands, spines, intervals. The old seafloor seems almost abstract under snow, yet the process remains the same beneath the stillness. Water is stored. Cold holds. The next thaw is already waiting. These changes in appearance matter because they deepen the answer without making it simple. The Lena Stone Forest is strange not only because of how it formed, but because its form is never read in one stable way. It oscillates between cliff and multitude, between wall and forest, between topographic edge and something that feels almost ceremonial, and the ridge view makes this instability impossible to miss. Distance compresses the pillars into ranks. Nearer towers merge into aligned ribs. Small irregularities disappear, and the large repeating pattern emerges. That large pattern is the broken margin of a carbonate platform. The forest is what a retreating limestone edge looks like when joints, bedding, frost runoff, and river incision all keep working together for a very long time. This broader perspective also introduces a quiet but important consequence. Once you see the formations as a stage in an ongoing retreat, permanence becomes harder to believe in. The pillars look ancient, and they are, but they are not ancient in the sense of being finished. They are ancient in the sense of having been exposed to process for a great length of time. That is different. A finished monument would resist interpretation. These cliffs invite it because they are still in motion, even while seeming still. One tower remains because the surrounding rock has left first. Another will narrow because a crack near its crown is already widening with each cycle of moisture and cold. A buttress that now appears massive is not exempt. It is simply at another point in the same sequence. This incompletion gives the ridge path a very particular feeling. You are not looking out over relics from a closed age. You are looking out over forms that are midway between continuity and disappearance. The plateau behind them will keep losing edge. The valley below will keep receiving fragments. The river will keep carrying away what it can. And the visible architecture of the escarpment will continue to rearrange itself beyond any single human memory. That long unfinished quality can be felt in the small details too. Some towers end in blunt crowns, as if truncated. Some appear split at the top, with a narrow notch suggesting a future detachment. Elsewhere, recesses climb inward from the face like unfinished separations. Each detail hints at what comes next, not dramatically, but with geological patience. A fracture has opened, therefore a block will someday detach. A ledge is undercut, therefore the mass above it will someday lose support. A talus fan below has stabilized enough for plants. Therefore, older material has already been resting there a long while. The ridge path teaches you to read these futures in the present. It also reveals how much the eye depends on scale. When you stand above the stone forest, the individual pillars no longer dominate the scene in the same way. The Lena River reasserts itself. The taiga extends outward. The escarpment becomes one element in a larger composition. And that is useful, because the pillars are strange, partly because they feel too elaborate for their setting when first encountered from below. From above, their setting explains them. The river valley supplied incision, the broad platform supplied mass, the continental climate supplied repeated freezing and thawing. The surrounding landscape, by being so comparatively subdued, made the exposed edge appear even more pronounced. A strange landform often becomes less uncanny when it is placed back into the system that produced it. Yet here, something curious happens. Understanding does not reduce wonder, it changes the source of it. At first, the wonder comes from resemblance. The cliffs look like ruins, pipes, trunks, towers. Later, the wonder comes from process. This entire improbable procession can arise from ordinary sedimentary layering, tectonic uplift, river cutting, and cold weather erosion. Then, from the ridge, a third kind of wonder appears. The place is still difficult to absorb emotionally, even after the mechanics are clear. Deep time remains larger than explanation. You can know how a plateau edge breaks apart and still feel that the result is almost impossible. That feeling is not confusion, it is scale meeting imagination. A human life does not easily contain the idea of a seabed becoming stone, then becoming upland, then becoming cliff, then becoming forest of pillars, then becoming rubble and soil. Yet all of that is present at once here. The ridge only makes that simultaneity more visible. Far down the line of the escarpment, the forms begin to dissolve into haze again. The pattern repeats beyond easy counting. That repetition matters. It prevents the pillars from feeling like a single spectacle. Instead, they feel like a condition of the valley, a long sentence written beside the Lena, a process carried along a great reach of river, not one isolated accident. And because it continues so far, the eye begins to trust that the same underlying logic holds from cove to cove and tower to tower. Fractures vary, beds vary, drainage varies, but the broad rule remains. This is the edge of an uplifted carbonate body, opened by valley incision and repeatedly sculpted by cold. From above, even the spaces between the most dramatic projections become eloquent. Empty gullies, recessed alcoves, and shadowed clefts all indicate removed stone. The entire escarpment can be read negatively, not just by what is there, but by what is gone. This is one of the deepest reasons the stone forest resembles architecture. Built structures are designed around voids as much as walls, corridors, openings, intervals, courts. The Lena cliffs acquired their architectural quality because erosion has carved space out of mass along repeating structural lines. Nothing was planned, but the result carries rhythm. Presence, absence, buttress, cleft, tower, recess, ledge, drop. The rhythm continues until the eye relaxes into it. At some viewpoints, the upper surface behind the cliffs seems almost calm enough to erase the drama below. Low vegetation, rolling ground, and the continuity of the plateau make the edge feel even sharper by contrast. A quiet top, a divided face, a debris slope below, then river. This vertical arrangement is almost too orderly to seem natural at first glance. Yet each level follows directly from the one before. The plateau survives inland because incision and exposure are less intense there. The face is dramatic because it is the active edge. The slope below receives what the face releases. The river removes enough material to keep the whole profile open. Once you see the arrangement in section, the landscape feels less like a mystery and more like a conversation between layers and forces. Still, there is no final neatness to it. Some sections of the escarpment resist the idealized pattern. A tower may stand farther out than expected. A recess may widen into an awkward gap. A slope may carry more debris than the neighboring one. These irregularities are important. They keep the cliffs from becoming too diagrammatic. Real erosion is specific. One joint opens more quickly. One bed is slightly more durable. One drainage line captures more meltwater. The stone forest is orderly in principle, irregular in detail. That balance is exactly what makes it believable and beautiful. As the ridge path continues, the sense of incompletion keeps gathering weight. These forms are not stable statues posed forever above the Lena. They are passing arrangements in the long denudation of a plateau. Denudation is a calm word for a slow stripping away of rock and surface. It can sound almost clinical, but here it becomes visible. You can see what remains of the old mass. You can see where it has been pared back. You can infer that what now looks permanent is merely a slower part of the same loss. That awareness changes how you look at every isolated pinnacle. Instead of asking how it came to stand, you begin asking what conditions have allowed it to stand so far. That phrase matters. So far. Geology often turns permanence into duration. The Lena Pillars have lasted a very long time. That is not the same as lasting forever. And perhaps the ridge is the best place to feel that distinction. Up here, the future of the cliff is easier to imagine, not in exact shapes, but in direction. The edge will keep retreating. Some towers will detach, some recesses will merge, some debris fans will expand. Some stabilized slopes will green a little more before new stone interrupts them again. The river will continue to flow at the base, accepting the products of change without hurry. None of this diminishes the present scene. It enlarges it. A landscape is often most alive when it can be seen as a moment in a much longer transformation. That thought begins to draw the attention downward again, not abruptly, only gradually. From the high patterned view, back toward the lower shadows, where the river runs and evening begins to gather in the cracks. Because once the broad geometry is visible, what remains is not another explanation so much as a mood shaped by all the explanations together. The knowledge settles. Marine sediments became carbonate rock. Regional uplift exposed them. The Lena cut into them. Cold opened them. Runoff and gravity separated them. Life entered the spaces between the losses. And now the whole escarpment stands beside the river as a form that is intelligible in process and still somehow difficult to believe in feeling. That is where the deepest strangeness lives. Not in not knowing, but in knowing and still finding the place unlike anything the mind expected. As the imagined path descends or lingers near the overlook, the sound world becomes simpler. Wind moves lightly over the upper ground. Far below, the river continues in broad, muted motion. Birds may cross the face, then disappear into the scale of stone. The cliffs themselves make almost no claim on the ear. They dominate by silence. And silence is important now, because it allows another consequence to emerge. The more fully the pillars are explained, the less they feel conquered. Instead, they become more patient. The landscape is not mysterious because it refuses reason. It is mysterious because reason unfolds across spans far larger than ordinary experience. A human question asks, why does it look like this? Geology answers, because a shallow sea accumulated carbonate sediment, because burial changed it, because uplift raised it, because a great river cut through it, because cold repeatedly widened fractures, because debris was cleared, because some parts resisted longer than others. The answer is complete enough, yet the emotional result is still silence. That mismatch between explanation and feeling is not a failure. It is the proper scale of the place. Evening, or what passes for evening under long northern light, makes that especially clear. As shadows lengthen, the spaces between pillars begin to fill first. Then ledges disappear. Then only the palest faces still catch light. The forest below becomes one continuous dark mass. The river loses reflection and becomes softer, less separate from the valley floor. The formations that seemed so legible under angled light begin to merge again into a wall, then into suggestion. This fading is a kind of final evidence. The stone forest is always part vision, part structure. Light reveals the divisions, darkness reunites them. Perhaps that is why the escarpment feels so difficult to classify. It is a place where details and holes keep trading places. From the river, many towers. From afar, one wall. From geology, one platform. From weathering, endless separations. From ecology, many small habitats. From time, one long process. No single view is wrong. They simply belong to different scales. And in the quiet after the climb, scale becomes the real subject. Not only the great horizontal scale of the escarpment beside the Lena, not only the vertical scale from river to ridge, but the scale of time embedded in the stone. It is one thing to say the rock began in ancient seas, it is another to sit with what that means. Every pale band across the face marks deposition long before this valley existed. Every fracture, enlarged by cold, required seasons beyond counting. Every fallen block below records a small victory of weather over mass. The present scene is made of durations that do not fit neatly into story, only into accumulation. That is why the place can feel older than ordinary old landscapes, not necessarily because it is older in every absolute sense, but because its formation remains visible in layers. Many landscapes hide their making under thick soil, dense vegetation, or later overprinting. The Lena Pillars still expose their own sequence. They are almost didactic in shape, yet emotionally elusive. You can point to the bedding, you can point to the joints, you can point to the talus, the river, the slope, the plateau. Still, when the light goes low and the stone begins to pale against darkening forest, the best word remains strange. Strange in the calmest sense. Not threatening, not uncanny in a sharp way, just quietly out of category. That feeling only deepens when you return, in imagination, to the riverbank. Down there, beneath the high viewpoints, the pillars regain some of their towering individuality. The broad pattern remains known now, but the body responds again to scale. A detached bastion leans over the slope. A narrow fin cuts the sky. A line of shadow at the base hints at a ledge or overhang you cannot quite read from below. Knowledge and sensation no longer oppose each other. They layer together. You know you are looking at remnants of a retreating carbonate escarpment. You also feel as though you are standing beneath something assembled by impossible patience. That blend of understanding and humility is the natural consequence of the whole journey through the landscape. Not mastery, adjustment. The mind adjusts itself to longer processes. The eye adjusts to slower causes. The imagination adjusts to the idea that an inland Siberian cliff can be old sea made vertical. This is where the story softens rather than resolves, because the pillars do not offer a neat ending. They offer continued presence. The river still moves. The stone still weathers. The forest still gathers beneath the pale walls. And every one of those actions will outlast the visit. It helps at this point to notice how little any single moment contains, and how much it suggests. A gust of wind across the slope tells you almost nothing by itself, yet wind helps dry one face faster than another. A patch of snow on a ledge seems small, yet it may hold moisture that enters a crack during thaw. A fallen fragment below the cliff is only one stone, yet it marks another step in the retreat of the escarpment. The Lena landscape is full of such minor present facts, carrying deep historical meaning. That is why stillness here never feels empty. It is full of deferred movement. One of the quietest forms of evidence lies in the sediment itself at the base of the valley and on more stable lower slopes. Fine material accumulates over time from weathered rock, dust, plant remains, and transported particles. Some of it comes directly from the carbonate cliffs. Some arrives from elsewhere in the basin. Mixed together, it becomes the thin, living skin over older debris. This is the beginning of forgetting. Fresh talus remembers the cliff very clearly. Older slope deposits become less obviously related to a specific detachment event. Plants cover them. Moisture reorganizes them. Roots knit them. But the escarpment keeps restoring the memory by adding new fragments. The valley floor and lower margin are always balancing between burial and renewal. That balance mirrors the larger one between continuity and division in the cliffs themselves. Nothing here is static enough to be final. Even the broad sense of silence changes with weather and season. In summer, insects and birds briefly animate the lower forest. In colder times, sound thins, and the river or wind may carry farther. Mist can absorb distance, clear dry air can sharpen it. The same pale tower may seem close one day and withdrawn the next. This matters because perception is part of the landscape's power. The Lena Pillars are not simply shaped by natural process. They are also received through changing atmospheric conditions that alter scale, clarity, and emotional tone. A cliff in hard noon sun is one kind of object. That same cliff in river mist is another. This is not superficial. It is one reason the formations continue to evade complete familiarity. You never see exactly the same Lena twice. The deeper lesson of the place may be patience, not as an abstract moral, but as a physical truth. Everything that explains the pillars is patient. Marine deposition is patient. Uplift is patient. River incision is patient. Frost weathering is patient. Ecological colonization of ledges and debris is patient. Even disappearance is patient. A tower does not collapse into meaninglessness. It narrows by fractions, loosens along one fracture, sheds fragments, becomes less than it was, and eventually passes its material downslope into other uses. The landscape practices time without drama. That may be why it feels restful to imagine, despite the severity of form, nothing is trying to become something quickly. Nothing is forcing an instant. The stone accepts sequence. The river accepts duration. The forest accepts short seasons and long waiting. And in that acceptance, the place becomes almost tender, though made of limestone and cold. What remains especially striking is how the entire explanation leads back to ordinary causes. Not ordinary in time scale, of course, but ordinary in type. Shallow seas deposit carbonate, rock layers are uplifted, rivers cut valleys, water enters fractures, cold expands it as ice, blocks fall, plants root where they can. This sequence could happen in many places, under varied forms, yet here, in this stretch above the Lena, the conditions met in a combination that produced an escarpment of unusual clarity and resonance. So the answer to the title becomes almost paradoxical. The Lena Stone Forest is strange because nothing about its making required strangeness. It is the patient assembly of common processes into an uncommon form. That is a more satisfying mystery than one solved by a single dramatic cause. It gives the planet more depth. It suggests that beauty does not have to come from rarity of law, only from rarity of arrangement. The stone forest is one arrangement among many the earth is capable of, but one that reveals itself with extraordinary calm. At the riverbank, this calm is easiest to feel late in the day. As the light lowers, the cliff faces stop looking purely white and begin to hold faint tones of grey, amber, and blue. Each narrow separation between towers deepens first, as if evening prefers the fractures. The result is subtle, but it changes the whole wall. What had been readable as many individual forms begins, slowly, to gather back into a single mass. That return to unity is important. It reminds you that the pillars are not separate creations. They are pieces of one body, temporarily distinguished by shadow, angle, and the long editing of weather. From the bank, the slope below the stone seems quieter now. Fragments lie where they have lain for years, or centuries, or longer, and the forest edge waits just beyond them. Nothing in the scene asks to be solved any further. And yet the longer you remain, the more one final difficulty presents itself. Even after all the processes are named, the pillars still do not feel fully reduced to process. That is not because the explanation is incomplete. it is because explanation and presence are not the same thing. You can understand that carbonate sediments hardened, uplifted, fractured, and retreated, but understanding those stages does not shrink the sensation of standing beneath them. If anything, it enlarges it. A single pale tower now carries several worlds at once. It is an exposed remnant of marine deposition. It is a product of tectonic quiet rather than violence. It is a cold weather sculpture shaped by freeze and thaw. It is also a present cliff, casting a present shadow over present trees. That layering is the real weight of the place, not heaviness in the emotional sense, more like density of meaning. The Lena Stone Forest never becomes strange for only one reason. It remains strange because every true answer leads to another scale. Look at the rock substance, and you find an ancient sea. Look at the shape, and you find frost and fracture. Look at the valley, and you find the river maintaining exposure. Look at the ledges, and you find life using whatever narrow foothold time has left. Look at the whole escarpment, and you find a plateau edge halfway through being unmade. That multiplication of truths is very gentle here. The landscape does not announce them, it simply allows them to sit together. The air by the river cools a little more. Mist may begin to gather where the water loses warmth into evening air, softening the base of the cliffs again. Then the old visual uncertainty returns. Some pillars seem to lift free of the slope. Others fade into the wall behind them. The stone forest moves back towards suggestion. And this softening has its own kind of evidence. A place that can alternate between exact geology and near dreamlike outline is often a place shaped by repetition at many scales. The Lena escarpment is exact in origin but not rigid in appearance. It changes under weather, season, distance, and the angle of your attention. That is why memory has trouble keeping it in one form. You remember towers, then a wall, then a ruined city, then a raised seabed, then simply pale stone above dark trees. None of these are wrong. The landscape keeps all of them available. It is worth pausing over that comparison to ruins because it appears so naturally and yet explains very little by itself. Ruins are usually understood as remains of intention. The Lena Pillars resemble that language of remains, but without intention anywhere in their making. They imitate architecture through erosion. They imitate design through structural weakness repeated over immense time. That is part of what unsettles and calms the mind at once. The forms feel familiar enough to read, but not human enough to close the question. So the imagination keeps circling, a fortress perhaps, a line of columns, a procession of figures. Then the eye notices bedding planes, talus, forest seams, and the spell breaks gently into geology again. This repeated movement between resemblance and reality may be one of the strongest reasons the place lingers in thought. It never settles permanently into a single metaphor. The mind reaches for one, then the rock outlasts it. In evening light, the upper edges of the pillars can look unexpectedly delicate, not fragile exactly, but thinned by distance and brightness. A broad buttress becomes a narrow rim against the sky. A split crown becomes a notch of dark air. A detached pinnacle that seemed massive under the sun is reduced to outline. This reduction is another reminder that scale is unstable here. The very same tower can feel monumental from its base and almost weightless from afar. The Lena landscape uses distance the way some places use weather. It changes character by how much of it you can hold at once. And because the cliffs stretch for such a long reach beside the river, you are never looking at one isolated object. You are always looking at a sequence. One tower is already giving way to the next. One recess is already answered by another projection farther down the wall. This continuity matters emotionally as much as geologically. A solitary pillar might feel dramatic. A long repeating margin feels patient. It belongs to duration, not spectacle. That patience becomes easier to feel when you imagine the pace of actual change. Not years, usually. Not even generations in any visually obvious sense. The retreat of the escarpment belongs to intervals so long that a human witness can only infer them. A fragment falls. A crack widens. Lichens spread across a stable face. Thin soil gathers behind a ledge. A tree roots in a place where old debris has finally rested long enough. These are not events in the ordinary sense. They are transitions. And the Lena Pillars are made almost entirely of transitions. Sediment to stone, stone to cliff, cliff to talus, talus to soil. Exposure to colonization, unity to division. It is this chain of transitions, more than any single form, that gives the place its calm authority. Nothing arrived here finished. Everything came through stages. Even now, the late light reveals how unfinished the whole escarpment remains. Some sections of the face still appear dense and little divided, as though the old plateau front is holding there for a while longer. Other sections are deeply partitioned, with towers almost fully separated from one another. Elsewhere, the slope below is burdened with more fallen material, suggesting more active release along that stretch in the recent geological past. These differences are useful. They show that the stone forest is not one age or one condition, it is many neighboring conditions, all belonging to the same long retreat. A ridge can be earlier in one place, later in another. One tower can be nearing detachment, while the next remains thick and strongly attached to the wall behind it. Variation, again, is what keeps the escarpment alive to the eye. If every section had the same spacing, the same height, the same profile, the place would lose much of its depth. Instead, repetition is always modified. That is how natural processes hold attention, through pattern with deviation. The river beneath them continues as if none of this requires acknowledgement. Its surface broadens and narrows with the channel. Its current shifts around bars, banks, and subtle changes in depth. In certain light, it reflects the limestone in broken, pale streaks. In others, it takes on the color of steel, or smoke, or muted green. This continuing indifference of the river is part of the atmosphere too. The Lena does not admire the pillars. It does not frame them on purpose. It simply persists along the base level that helps keep them visible. That modest relationship is strangely moving. One process supports another without intention. The river does not know it has exposed a stone forest. The frost does not know it has carved towers. The rock does not know it remembers a sea. Yet together they produce a landscape that feels almost composed. This is one of the quietest beauties in geology. Purpose is not required for coherence. As dusk deepens, the forest at the base becomes less individual. Separate trunks and canopies give way to a single dark band. That simplification has its own consequence. Now the pillars seem to rise out of darkness more completely than before. The taiga no longer competes for detail. It becomes foundation. And once the lower world is reduced to mass, the pale stone above appears more remote, more suspended, and a little more difficult to measure. This, too, is why the Lena can feel almost unreal in photographs or memory. The visual layers often sort themselves into strong contrasts. Dark forest, pale cliff, soft sky, reflective river. The composition seems too clear, as though the land had arranged itself around a thought. But clarity in appearance comes from complexity in making. The line is simple only because the sequence behind it was so long. There is another quiet fact present in this darkening view. The cliff line you see now is only the current front of a much larger history of removal. Behind the visible face lies more carbonate bedrock, less dramatically exposed. Behind that lies the vanished continuity of the ancient platform. And before that lies the sea itself. So even a single silhouette against evening sky contains absences layered behind absences. The tower stands where neighboring stone no longer stands. The plateau exists where the river has not cut so deeply. The rock exists where sediment once lay loose beneath shallow water. Loss and survival are interlocked at every depth of the story. This may be why the place feels solemn without sadness. It is full of removal but not of tragedy. Erosion here is not damage in the human sense. It is transformation proceeding at the tempo of earth. The escarpment does not mourn what has gone. It reveals that going is the condition of the form itself. That thought helps explain the feeling of humility that often comes with such landscapes. Not because the cliffs are threatening. They are not. but because they place human duration inside a much wider field. A person arrives, looks, perhaps learns the basic story, and leaves. The river continues. The stone continues to divide. Winter stores water in cracks again. Spring releases it. Moss deepens in one seam. A ledge loosens somewhere beyond sight. And all of this remains almost completely unconcerned with being witnessed. Such indifference can be cold in some settings. Here it feels peaceful. The Lena Pillars do not require attention to justify themselves. They endure as process. And perhaps that is why they calm the mind instead of agitating it. There is no demand in them, only duration. If you follow the riverbank a little farther in imagination, the wall keeps changing even in low light. A section that had looked crowded with narrow ribs opens into broader masses. Then a cove appears, where erosion or drainage has cut farther back. Then the procession tightens again. This unevenness answers another part of the title quietly. The stone forest is strange, not because it breaks every expectation, but because it keeps almost meeting expectations before changing them. You think you are seeing a wall, then towers emerge. You think you are seeing isolated towers, then distance merges them again. You think you are seeing a static landform, then every geological detail says retreat. You think you are seeing barren stone, then a ledge holds shrubs, a crack holds moss, a slope holds pines. It is always a little more or a little less than the category first offered. That instability is gentle enough to be pleasing. In many places, ambiguity can feel tense. Here it feels spacious. The cliffs are not trying to deceive. They are simply too layered in cause and appearance to be finished in one glance. This is especially true when the valley begins to dim and only the highest pale surfaces remain lit. At that moment, the stone forest seems almost to withdraw from the earth below. The river is dark now. The forest nearly disappears into one mass. Only the upper limestone still holds the day. For a few minutes, the whole escarpment can look less like part of the valley than like an exposed margin of older light. Then that fades too, and when it does, the forms are not lost entirely. They remain as interruptions in the sky, as darker and lighter blocks of tone, as memory more than detail. This transition into low visibility is not an ending. It is another lesson in what the cliffs are. They are legible only in part at any moment. Full detail belongs to daylight and close attention. Broader unity belongs to distance and dusk. Deep history belongs to knowledge carried into the scene. No single condition contains the whole, Lena. To know the place even partially, you have to allow those conditions to overlap. The silence deepens as detail drains away. And in that silence, the processes become easier to imagine than to see. Somewhere along the wall, water may still be moving into a fracture from melt, rain, or seepage held in higher ground. Somewhere, a thin layer of sediment behind a ledge supports roots that are widening a crack grain by grain. Somewhere, a fallen block rests on a slope that will hold it for a very long time before further weathering breaks it down. Somewhere along the broad upland behind the cliffs, drainage is already choosing future lines of weakness where retreat will one day continue. These are all invisible from the bank at dusk, yet they are the real activity of the stone forest. The visible towers are only the present surfaces of a larger invisible conversation between rock, water, cold, and time. It helps, here, to return one last time to the question of why this place feels older than many other landscapes. Part of it is geological truth. These rocks do preserve an ancient marine chapter. Part of it is preservation of structure. The bedding and the retreating edge remain readable. Part of it is the northern setting, where sparse vegetation and long seasons of cold keep some forms clear. But another part is emotional. The Lena Pillars give age a shape that people recognize instinctively. Vertical repetition, pale weathered stone, long silence, and visible decay all suggest duration without needing to say it. The cliffs do not merely contain deep time. They resemble what deep time feels like when translated into form. That resemblance is hard to explain and easy to sense. A long wall of fractured carbonate over a remote river should, in theory, become simpler the more you know about it. Instead, it becomes fuller. The knowledge does not empty the image of mystery. It relocates mystery from cause to coexistence. How can one place hold warm sea, cold plateau, river corridor, frost geometry, and living taiga all at once? The answer is obvious in geology and still astonishing in thought. By sequence, by accumulation, by the refusal of earlier worlds to disappear completely inside later ones. That is what the Lena keeps showing. Old conditions remain as material, new conditions arrive as process. The landscape is where they meet. Now the lower valley is nearly all shadow. The cliffs are only partly visible. The river sounds broader than it looks, and the great pale wall, for all its complexity, becomes very simple again, just a raised margin above moving water. This reduction is comforting. After all the layers of explanation, the scene can still return to first impression, without contradiction. Stone above river, forest below, sky over both. The mind is allowed to rest there. But rest does not mean emptiness. It means the story has sunk into the shape of the place. You no longer need to keep every mechanism in conscious sequence. You can simply look and know that everything here belongs to long arrangement. That arrangement will continue after dark. Winter will come again and hold. Spring will loosen what winter has stored. The river will rise and lower, over spans beyond counting. The escarpment will retreat by measures too fine for ordinary memory. And still, from season to season, from one generation of trees to the next, the stone forest will remain recognizable enough to seem unchanged. This is one of the strangest gifts of geology. Change can be relentless and still appear as permanence. The Lena Pillars embody that paradox almost perfectly. They are active ruins made by no builder. They are a dissolving wall that looks steadfast. They are a former seafloor standing like a mountain edge above a northern river. And because all of those statements remain true at once, the landscape never quite settles into familiarity. Even after long attention, it stays a little beyond the reach of ordinary naming. That is why the silence here feels full rather than vacant. The place has not run out of meaning, it has simply stopped needing to display it. The river moves in darkness now with the same patience it moved in morning light. The forest remains gathered at the base of the slopes. The pale stone, where any light still touches it, keeps just enough brightness to suggest its height. And if you imagine returning in another season, the entire valley alters without losing itself. In early summer, the river may be fuller, the forest fresher, the air softer at the edge of the water. The limestone would still rise in pale ranks, but the ledges might hold more green, the lower slopes more active life. In autumn, the color below would warm briefly before dimming into cold. The cliffs would feel starker then, more detached from the changing vegetation. In winter, snow would reduce some of the smaller complexities and reveal others. The escarpment would become more graphic, more silent, and in some ways more obviously a product of cold. These seasonal identities matter because they prevent the stone forest from being a fixed image. It is always itself, but never in one mood. That is another reason it resists complete possession by the mind. You can know its structure and still not know its next appearance under another sky, another season, another layer of mist. The landscape keeps a reserve, not secrecy exactly, just variability. And variability is one of the signatures of a living geological setting. Even a place built from stone is not static if light, moisture, frost, vegetation, and river level continue to change the terms of how it is seen and how it weathers. There is one more consequence hidden in this seasonal shifting. Because the pillars appear differently across the year, they also suggest different explanations to the casual eye. In bright summer, they may look almost decorative, an improbable ornament beside the Lena. In winter, they may look more severe, more clearly tied to frost and fracture. In haze, they may seem architectural. Under clear, hard light, they become plainly sedimentary, all beds and joints and sharp relief. The landform educates slowly by changing its face. Stay with it long enough, and it teaches that no single appearance is sufficient. This teaching by repetition and variation mirrors the geology itself. The rock was formed by repeated deposition with variation between beds. It was sculpted by repeated freeze and thaw with variation between fractures. It is inhabited by repeated seasonal cycles with variation between ledges, slopes, and exposures. At every level, the same principle returns. The Lena Stone Forest is built from recurrence altered by difference. That is perhaps the most exact answer available. And because recurrence is slow, the answer arrives slowly too. The valley at nightfall holds this slowness very well. Edges soften, distances become less exact, the limestone withdraws into pale patches and long shadows. Now the mind supplies more of the wall than the eye does. That shift is fitting. So much of this landscape has always depended on imagination guided by evidence. You imagine the sea because the rock demands it. You imagine the retreat of the escarpment because the talus and fractures demand it. You imagine future collapse because present separations demand it. And now, in low light, you imagine the full length of the stone forest continuing beyond what you can see, because the river and the earlier views have already taught you its continuity. In that sense, the Lena is a place where visible fact and quiet inference are constantly working together. That cooperation leaves the mind in an unusual state, not puzzled, not resolved, something gentler, alert, but unhurried, satisfied by the causes and still moved by the form. There are not many landscapes that maintain that balance so steadily. Some astonish at first and then flatten into explanation. Others become interesting only after technical understanding arrives. The Lena Pillars do both at once. Their first impression is powerful, their explanation is richer, and the explanation returns you to the first impression with more depth rather than less. So even